Ahoy, mateys! Welcome to Podcasts of the Caribbean, a podcast covering the world of Pirates of the Caribbean, from the theme parks to the movies and everything in between. My name is Justin Helmer, and I will be your host on this voyage through the Caribbean. It'd be too late to alter course now, mateys. Hello, and welcome back to Podcasts of the Caribbean. This is episode 69, and today we are continuing our countdown celebration leading up to Dead Man's Chest 20th anniversary. In today's episode, we're going to be diving into the junior novelization for Pirates of the Caribbean Dead Man's Chest. Surprisingly, there are a bunch of differences between the novelization and the film, as the novelization was based off an earlier draft of the movie. So this means the novelization contains some of the deleted scenes, extra lines of dialogue, and other things that were eventually omitted from the finished film. And this isn't just the case for the Dead Man's Chest novelization, as all the novelizations for the other films also contain differences between the movie and the book, and we will definitely be covering them later on in the podcast. But today we're going to be focusing on the Dead Man's Chest novelization, as of course the movie is turning 20 years old, and we're going to see how the book differed from the completed film. So let's jump right in and start at the beginning. The first difference between the film and the book is that instead of starting with Will and Elizabeth's wedding, the novelization actually begins at the Turkish prison. And the reason for this is that the movie would have originally opened this way, as many other production drafts of the film started with Jack's escape from the Turkish prison instead of the scenes in Port Royal. When Jack gets back to the Black Pearl, his dialogue to Gibbs is different here. In the film, Jack says, "Complications arose, ensued, and were overcome." But in the book, Jack says, "Complications arose, but I found if you ask right, there's always someone willing to give you a leg up." And that is, of course, when Jack gives Gibbs the skeleton leg from the coffin. But after that, Gibbs replies, "Not in my experience. Can't go wrong expecting the worst in people." And Jack then says, "It probably does save time." And then there is a different line of dialogue when Jack attempts to shoot Jack the monkey. Gibbs says, "You know that don't do no good." And instead of Jack saying, "It does me," he says, "Keeps my aim sharp. Why'd that eviscerated simian have to be the only thing to survive Isla de Muerta?" And then once the piece of cloth drops down to the deck, in the film we know that Marty runs and picks it up. But in the book, an unnamed pirate picks up the cloth, and Marty is actually never named in the novelization at all, which is very interesting. But a little later on, we have the moment where, in the film, Gibbs says, "Captain, I think the crew, meaning me as well, we're expecting something a bit more shiny, what with the Isle de Muerta going all pear-shaped, reclaimed by the sea and the treasure with it." And then Leach, of course, says, "And the Royal Navy chasing us all around the Atlantic." And then Marty then adds, "And the hurricane." But in the book, however, while the first part of this moment where it mentions Isla de Muerta is the same, it differs after that. Gibbs says in the book, "And then spending months fighting to get the British Navy off our stern." To which Jack replies, "Inevitable outcome of la vie du buccaneer." That is French for the life of a buccaneer, or more simply, the life of a pirate. But after that, Gibbs says, "We've been losing crew at every port, and it seems to us what's left that's been a stretch since we've done even a speck of honest pirating." Did you notice what's missing there? The novelization doesn't even mention the hurricane at all, and neither does it mention it when Norrington shows up later on in Tortuga. Given that this book was based off an earlier draft of the film, we can see the hurricane itself was something that was added into the movie closer to filming, which is very interesting. But the last thing I want to highlight from this chapter is the dialogue between Marty and Gibbs, where in the film, Marty says, "Have you noticed lately the captain seems to be acting a bit strange?" And Gibbs says, "Setting course for that knowing his own heading? Something's got Jack vexed, and mark my words, what bodes ill for Jack Sparrow bodes ill for us all." However, in the book, Marty's dialogue is spoken by a random pirate, since Marty essentially doesn't exist in this novelization. But Gibbs replies, "Something's got him setting a course without knowing his own heading, and I thought there was neither man nor beast alive could make him do that." And while I do love the version in the movie, I do think that line is also really, really good. But after that, we finally go over to Port Royal in Chapter 2, where we pick up with Elizabeth in the rain. Everything moves like it does in the film, but then we get this line. Beckett ceremoniously read off his newly appointed powers by the Royal Commission for Antilles Trade and Protection. then produced a warrant for the arrest of one William Turner. Now, if you look this up, this is a fictional organization made for the film, but this was actually sourced from one of the screenplays of the movie. In that, Beckett actually says this line out loud before pulling out the arrest warrant for Will. It was, however, cut from later drafts and did not make it into the movie, as we all know. But the next chapter then takes us back to the Black Pearl, and it opens with Jack in his cabin before, of course, he heads below decks to get more rum. When he emerges out of his cabin, we actually see the deleted scene where Leach asks for a heading and Jack replies, "Steady as she goes." But then we get the scene of Jack and Bootstrap Bill, where we get some extra dialogue here as well. Bootstrap mentions that Jones sent him as an emissary, and when Bootstrap is explaining what happened to him, he says, "Everything went wrong after that. I ended up cursed, doomed to the depths of the ocean, unable to move, unable to die. All I could do was think, and mostly I thought if I had even the tiniest hope of escaping this fate, I would take it, trade anything for it." And then Jack then replies, "That is the kind of thinking bound to catch his attention." And Bootstrap says, "It did. Davy Jones came, made the offer. I could spend 100 years before his mast, with the hope that after, I would go on to a peaceful rest." And while none of this is really new information, it is still really cool to see a bit more context provided about Bootstrap's deal with Davy Jones. And I love Jack's line here too. It's super foreboding and shows even Jack doesn't want to say Davy Jones' name out loud, which is really, really cool. I love that. But later, Jack receives the black spot, as we see in the movie, and Bootstrap says this: "It's not a matter of how long till it comes after you. It's a matter of how long till you're found." Another really cool line. But chapter 4 then begins with the fishing boat being swallowed by the Kraken after Jack loses his hat, and then Will's conversation with Beckett. But when we get to the scene where Will and Weatherby Swan see Elizabeth in the jail cell, we actually have more dialogue between Governor Swan and the prison guard, whose name happens to be Caruthers. So Caruthers says, "You can't be here, Mr. Swan." And Governor Swan says, "Governor Swan, I'm not wearing this wig to keep my head warm, you know." "Caruthers, isn't it? Enjoy your job, Mr. Caruthers?" And then Caruthers says, "Yes, sir, particularly when the folks come up to visit the prisoners." Governor Swan then replies, "Very good," and Caruthers leaves to give the group some privacy. This is a nice little moment that I think shows Governor Swan's character a bit more. He immediately knows the guard's name and gets the guard to kind of soften up a bit, which in my opinion shows what a great governor Weatherby Swan was, or at least he was trying to be. And while we don't get much of this in the films, and we don't really get too much expansion into Governor Swan's character as a whole in the movies, I personally think Governor Swan cared a lot about the people in Port Royal. But in addition to that moment, we also get some extra dialogue between Will and Elizabeth. Will tells her, "If I hadn't set Jack free," he began, trailing off regretfully, "I never expected you would bear the consequences." Elizabeth smiled. "I share the consequences gladly." She reached through the bars and took his hands. "How are you going to find him?" she asked anxiously. Her confidence touched Will's heart. He suddenly felt he could do anything. "Tortuga. I'll start there and not stop searching until I find him. And then I will come back here and marry you." "Properly?" Elizabeth asked. "Eagerly," Will promised. So I love the little extra dialogue in that moment. It's very, very cool. But after that, we start chapter 5 with the montage of Will looking for Jack. In addition to the lines we have in the movie, there's actually an extra one here of a tavern innkeeper telling Will that Jack ran off with a Creole woman to Madagascar. She was half his age and twice his height. And then when Will gets to Tortuga, only Scarlet is present here, and she is the one who slaps Will, as Giselle for some reason is not present in this book. But then we progress as normal as Will arrives on Isla de Pelagostos. Just like in the movie, Will runs into Cotton's parrot, and we actually get an extended scene here which is not in the film. So in the book it says, "Will turned toward the dense jungle and saw a flutter in the branches. It was Cotton's parrot. 'Good to see a familiar face,' Will said to the old bird, now even sure Jack and the crew were on the island. 'Don't eat me,' the parrot squawked. 'I'm not even hungry,' Will said as he looked for a path through the jungle. 'Don't eat me,' the parrot screamed even louder. Will turned his attention back to the bird. 'Look, you're nothing but feather and bones, and you probably taste like pigeon.' The parrot went silent. 'Sorry,' Will said, feeling badly. 'That was uncalled for. Listen, if anyone should ask, tell them Will Turner went into the jungle in search of Jack Sparrow. Understand? Will sighed. I'm talking to a parrot, he said to himself. Aye, aye, sir, the parrot answered, bobbing his head. I love this moment, and it's so hilarious. And you can actually see a bit of this scene being filmed in some of the behind-the-scenes footage on the Dead Man's Chest DVD. You can see Will saying that line of, look, you're nothing but feather and bones, and you probably taste like pigeon. But I don't know if they filmed the rest of the scene or only that line, but I would love to see this whole scene with Orlando Bloom doing all that. I think it's absolutely hilarious. But the fact that Will even apologizes to Cotton's parrot is just so funny. But of course, Will then gets captured, and then we go on to Chapter 6, which starts with Governor Swan freeing Elizabeth from the jail in Port Royal. Now, in the book, when Elizabeth gets into the carriage, her father gives her the pistol she uses later when she interrogates Beckett. And this, of course, is also shown in one of the deleted scenes, but the dialogue from that deleted scene is not present here in the book. But once they get to the harbor, we of course have the scene where Mercer kills that captain, and in the book, that captain actually has a name, and that name is Captain Hawkins. This wasn't made up for the book as it was in an earlier draft of the script, but it was, however, inspired by Treasure Island's main character, Jim Hawkins. But when Mercer asks where Elizabeth is, we get the same who from Weatherby Swan, to which Mercer replies, Elizabeth! And then we get this hilarious line where Weatherby says, she was always a willful child. But we see Weatherby being put in irons before he is taken away, which of course we do not see in the movie. And then Chapter 7 begins with the scene between Beckett and Elizabeth. But everything flows just like the film for a little while, so we're going to skip ahead a bit. And now we come to Pintel and Righetti's introduction scene, and they actually reach the shore of Isla de Pelagostos without their rowboat capsizing. And everything then goes as normal, and Leech and the pirates in the other bone cage still fall to their deaths, although it does happen after the cannibal sees them moving up the chasm wall. But the book quickly moves through the escape scene, and Chapter 12 begins with everyone aboard the Black Pearl. I love this little moment in the book where Will tries to get Jack's attention multiple times, but Jack keeps saying, not now, until he looks up at Will and says, oh, you. But then we get dialogue from one of the deleted scenes from Dead Man's Chest, although it is a bit different. So in the book, Will says, in exchange, you'll be granted full pardon and commissioned as a privateer in service to England. Jack sighed. I wonder what my crew will think when they see you've skewered their beloved and duly chosen captain. I think they will see it as an example, Will told him sternly. All right, Jack nodded. You get the compass, you rescue your bonny lass. Where's my profit? You get full pardon, Will explained. Freedom. A commission. Jack shook his head. No, accepting those things is what you want from me. Don't you want to know what I want from you? And then the scene progresses as normal, and after this we actually have the scene of the ghost dress on the Edinburgh trader, which of course is way earlier than it shows up in the actual movie. But Chapter 14 then sees the crew making their way up the Pantano River to see Tia Dalma. And here we actually have the deleted scene of the extended conversation between Will and Gibbs. This is actually one of my favorite deleted scenes from the film, and I'll go over the dialogue here for you all in case you aren't familiar. So in the book, Gibbs says, Jack has run afoul of none other than Davy Jones himself. Thinks he's only safe on land. If he goes out to open water, he'll be taken. By Davy Jones, Will asked in disbelief. Jack never seemed scared of anyone. But then we have the speech from Gibbs that's in the film, and afterward we go back to more of the deleted dialogue, and Will says, never thought Jack the type to be afraid of dying. And then Gibbs says, aye, but with Jones it ain't about the dying, it's about the punishment. Think of the worst fate you can conjure for yourself, stretching on and on forever. Well, that's what awaits you in Davy Jones' locker. So as I already said, I really love this scene, and I wish it made it into the film, as it really does explain Davy Jones' locker a lot more. It demonstrates the idea that Davy Jones' locker is a personal hell for whoever is trapped there, which is why for Jack, the locker manifests as a barren beach with no water in sight, and the Black Pearl is stuck in the middle of it, unable to sail anywhere. But I do understand why they cut this out, as they wanted to keep this movie focused on Davy Jones and the Davy Jones locker stuff, more so for At World's End. But then we go through the scene with Tia Dalma, and we eventually make it to when Will boards the shipwreck. We actually get some names here of some of the ship's crew when Will talks to the frightened sailor. He mentions the waves took Billy and Quentin, and apparently those names also appeared in an earlier draft of the script. And then, of course, the Flying Dutchman arrives, and we get one of my favorite lines in the film, which is, "Down on your marrow bones and pray." But surprisingly, the person who says this line in the book is Greenbeard instead of Clanker. And what's even more interesting is the book also mentions Greenbeard is the bosun of the Dutchman, which is not correct, as in the film, Jimmy Legs is the one who's referred to as bosun. So it seems the title was switched between the characters throughout different drafts of the script. But then, of course, we get the introduction of Davy Jones. Now, what is interesting is that the book mentions Jones walking with an ivory cane, and one of his legs being nothing but whalebone. This, of course, differs from how he appears in the film, where he has a crab leg and does not use a cane. But this is actually very interesting, as many pieces of merchandise actually did have Davy Jones using a cane. For instance, the Zizzle action figure of Davy Jones did actually come with a cane, so it seems like this was an element that stayed throughout a good amount of production before it ended up being scrapped. But the story progresses as normal here, and we eventually then make it to Tortuga. Now, in the movie, this is where the ghost dress scene is, but that actually already took place in the book a little earlier, as I already explained. So now we're at Tortuga, and Jack and Gibbs are of course recruiting sailors. But after they recruit those 4 sailors we see in the movie, which aren't actually shown in the book, Gibbs then says to Jack, "Nothing better happened to me." To which Jack replies, "I make no promises." And then Gibbs says, "You'd best be coming up with a new plan, Jack, and it better not be relying on that compass. The whole crew knows it ain't worked since he was saved from the gallows." But then after this moment, Norrington walks up, and Gibbs, of course, asks, "What's your story?" And we actually get a completely different speech from Norrington in the book. So this is what he says. "My story," the man replied. "Same as your story, just one chapter behind. I became obsessed with capturing a notorious pirate. Chased him across the 7 seas. I lost all perspective. I was consumed. The pursuit cost me my crew, my commission, and my life." And like I said earlier in the episode, there is no mention at all of the hurricane in this scene either. But then the fight, of course, breaks out, and Jack and Gibbs slip away. Elizabeth, of course, shows up and fights and eventually knocks out Norrington, and after he's thrown into the pig pen, Elizabeth says the line, "James Norrington, what has the world done to you?" To which Norrington replies in the book, "Nothing I didn't deserve." I love that line so much, and I really wish it made it into the film as it was in earlier drafts of the script. I think it's a fantastic line that really demonstrates James Norrington's downfall in a very, very short moment, and I would have loved having that line in the film. I think it really completes that moment. But anyway, we then go over to the Dutchman, and it goes through the same scene with Will seeing his father, and then of course getting punished. But now we come to a deleted scene, which we can also find in the book. Will says the line, "So I'm to understand what you did was an act of compassion. Then I guess I am my father's son. For nearly a year I've been telling myself that I killed you to save you." Then Bootstrap says, "You killed me?" And Will replies, "I lifted the curse you were under, knowing it would mean your death. But at least you would no longer suffer the fate handed to you by Barbossa." And this is where we get the very interesting part of this scene, where Bootstrap questions Will and asks, "Barbossa? Who is Barbossa?" And Will then replies, "Captain Barbossa, the man who led the mutiny aboard the Black Pearl, who left you to live forever at the bottom of the ocean?" And Bootstrap then says, "Oh, of course. It's the gift and the lie given by Jones. You join the crew and think you've cheated the powers, but it's not reprieval you've found. It's oblivion. Losing what you were, bit by bit, till you end up like poor Wyvern here." And this is another one of my favorite deleted scenes, and I really wish it made it into the film. But then after that, we of course go to the Liar's Dice scene, which actually does also include the deleted scene of the first dice game that we don't see in the film. The novelization contains both games that Will and Davy Jones play, but it does really trim down the length of the scene. But if you're unfamiliar with what happens in the first Liar's Dice game, Will actually wins the first game for his father's freedom, but then Bootstrap ends up losing it when he's called a liar in the second game, which is the one we see in the film. But Will then goes on to steal the key from Jones, and when he's getting ready to leave the Dutchman, he asks his father to come with him. But Bootstrap says, "I can't. I'm part of the ship now, Will. I can't leave. Take this. Always meant for you to have it." Bootstrap then gives Will the knife, and then Will says, I will see you free of this prison, I promise you. Which, of course, is a variation of what he says in the film. But up next, we actually have a scene that is not present in the film, nor the deleted scenes. So let's go through that real quick. So in the book, it says, the next morning, a large crewman arrived to take Bootstrap's place on watch. He found the old pirate asleep and kicked him hard. Show a leg before the captain spots you. Suddenly, the crewman's eyes fell on the white sails of the Edinburgh trader. All hands! Ship a quarter stern! Davy Jones came on deck and looked out to sea. Who stood watch last night? The crew pushed Bootstrap forward. How is it, Bootstrap, you let a ship pass by unnoticed? The tentacled captain asked. Begging your mercy, Captain. I fell sound asleep. Begging your mercy, it won't happen again. Bring the sun, Jones ordered. He's not on board, sir, a crewman said. One of the longboats is missing. Jones immediately understood. He met Bootstrap's eye and watched the pirate's face grow pale. Jones pulled the chain from his shirt. The key was gone. There was only one person tricky enough to be behind this. Jack Sparrow, he shouted. Captain Jack Sparrow. So that's a neat little scene, and I wonder if that was also in an earlier draft of the script, but I can definitely see why it was cut. However, it is still really cool seeing something completely new in this book. But then, of course, we have the Kraken attack on the Edinburgh trader, and in the book, this whole scene is shortened to one small paragraph. And after the attack is over, Will instead climbs onto the stern of the Dutchman instead of climbing under the figurehead on the bow. But then we, of course, arrive at Isla Cruces, and there is another deleted scene that is shown here in the book. It's the scene between Elizabeth and Norrington, where they see the abandoned church up on the hill. Just like in the deleted scene, Norrington says, I didn't expect anyone to be here. And Elizabeth replies, there's not. Norrington then asks, do you know this place? And then Elizabeth says, stories. The church came to the island and brought salvation, and disease, and death. They say the priest had to bury everybody one by one. It drove him mad and he hung himself. After this, Norrington then says one of my favorite lines, better mad with the rest of the world than sane alone. But after this, Jack then shows up and breaks up the moment with his line, no fraternizing with the help, love. But once they dig up that big chest, we actually get a bit more information about what was in there along with the dead man's chest. A strand of white pearls, a long white dress, dried flowers, and faded love letters. But then, of course, they pull out the dead man's chest, and Will shows up. And once the fight starts, we actually get another deleted scene here, which is the pot kettle black scene, which is just an extension of the standoff before the fight actually begins. But the sequence on Isla Cruces plays out normally just like it does in the movie, so now we're back aboard the Black Pearl after Norrington ran off with the chest, and Jack of course thinking that he has the heart in the jar of dirt. But then we get some other extra dialogue here where Gibbs says to Jack, we've spied the Dutchman an hour past, rounding the point. Jack asks, is that so? Gibbs then shouts, all hands, set sail, runner full. But Jack then asks, Gibbs, is your throat tight? To which Gibbs replies, aye. Jack continues and says, your heart beats fast, your breath is short, you have an acute awareness of the vulnerability of your own skin? And Gibbs replies, aye, again. Jack then diagnoses him and says, I fear you suffer from the malady of intense and overwhelming fear. But Gibbs is still on edge and says, what's into you? We've only got half a chance at best, and that's if the wind holds. But this whole moment, of course, is Jack thinking that he's safe, with Gibbs still thinking the Dutchman is coming after them, and of course Gibbs ends up being right, as, just like in the movie, the Dutchman surfaces next to the Pearl, and surprisingly, we actually do not have the jar of dirt scene in the book. Instead, the chase scene between the Pearl and the Dutchman immediately begins, and the Pearl quickly outruns the Dutchman. But while everyone is celebrating, we actually have some extra dialogue here between Will and Jack. Will says, if we can outrun her, we can take her. We should turn and fight. Jack then says, or flee like the cowardly weasels we are. Will then replies, you've the only ship as can match the Dutchman. In a fair fight, we've got half a chance. And then Jack harkens back to a line from The Curse of the Black Pearl and says, that's not much incentive for me to fight fair then, is it? I love that little callback there, and it would have been really cool to see that line show up in Dead Man's Chest. But then we have the Kraken attack on the Pearl, which spans literally 3 pages altogether. Jack begins to row away, but of course returns like he does in the movie. But the major difference here is that the entire plan with the gunpowder and the rum net is completely missing in the book. And so is Jack's heroic moment where he shows up and shoots the rifle, which scares the Kraken away. In the book, the Kraken is still attacking the Pearl when Elizabeth notices Jack has returned, and he gives the order to abandon ship while the Kraken is still wrapping itself around the Pearl. This is a major difference from the film where we have that kind of quiet moment where the Kraken is gone and everyone tries to get off the ship. But in the book here, that all that chaos is still happening while they're trying to get off. And in the book here, Jack actually takes Will's dialogue where he is the one that says, "We can get away as it takes down the Pearl." However, while that is different, Elizabeth still chains Jack to the mast and they still have the kiss moment. But right after Elizabeth gets into the longboat, the Kraken rises up to Jack and then we have the Hello Beastie moment. Jack has that noble sacrifice and the crew watches as the Kraken takes down the Pearl. And then we go over to the Dutchman where Davy Jones still has his line of "Jack Sparrow, our debt is settled." But after that line, there is something extra here that we don't have in the film. Bootstrap is also present on deck watching the Pearl be taken down, and he actually says a new line of dialogue here that we don't see in the movie, so let me read what it says. As Jack went down with the ship, Bootstrap's eyes grew wide with shock. What was left of Bootstrap's cursed heart wrenched. With eyes full of sorrow, Bootstrap Bill looked out toward the still water where Jack and the Pearl had so recently been sailing. He remembered Jack Sparrow, Captain Jack Sparrow, with a heavy heart. Quietly and painfully, Bill whispered out toward the empty sea, "If any man could beat the devil, I'd have thought it would be you." So I love that line from Bootstrap, as it really shows his connection to Jack. One of the things that we don't really see at all in the movies is Jack and Bootstrap's friendship. They barely interact at all in the movies, as they only have the one scene together at the start of Dead Man's Chest. And this line really shows that friendship and bond between them. I really wish this line made it into the film, as it honestly is such a fantastic moment. However, I do know why it's not in the movie. As we know from the film, after the Edinburgh trader is taken down by the Kraken, Bootstrap is then put into the brig, which of course would make it very hard for him to be on deck watching the Pearl be dragged down by the Kraken. But after this moment, we of course move to the scene at Tiadama's shack, right? Actually, no, we do not, because the book ends here. The final line in the novelization is this: "The Black Pearl was gone, along with her captain, and already the world seemed a bit less bright without them." So obviously that of course is taken from Gibbs' dialogue in Tiadama's shack at the end of the film. But yeah, the novelization actually ends here. A pretty bleak ending, I think, for a junior novelization. But I'm assuming the reason they didn't put the ending of this in the film is, of course, in the movie, we of course have a major reveal at the end of the film with Barbossa coming back. And I think this novelization came out before the film released, so they didn't want to spoil that big moment in this book and have that out for everyone to see. It's the same kind of thing that happened with the At World's End novelization, as the first edition of the At World's End novelization actually ends with Elizabeth's Hoist the Color speech, and the whole Maelstrom part of the film is completely omitted from the book. They did make a complete edition, I believe, of that novelization after the film came out, which did have the rest of the film, but they wanted to, of course, kind of get away from those big spoilers at the end of the film. So that's the reason why the ending of the movie is not present in this book, although it is kind of weird how it just ends here on a cliffhanger. But that, of course, wraps up the junior novelization of Pirates of the Caribbean: Dead Man's Chest. Hopefully you all enjoyed going through this with me to see how it differed from the final film. And like I said at the beginning of the episode, I do plan on covering the other novelizations for the other films too, but I thought doing the Dead Man's Chest one would be a fun thing to cover for the 20th anniversary. And also, thanks to the Pirates of the Caribbean Wiki for once again being a fantastic resource for me and all the fans. I do also want to give the Pirates Wiki a shout out because it recently turned 20 years old a few weeks ago, so happy 20th anniversary to the incredible Pirates of the Caribbean Wiki, and thanks to everyone who maintains and updates it. But anyway, thank you for listening to this episode, and thank you if you've left a rating or review wherever you listen. Next week, we're going to be finishing our celebration of Dead Man's Chest 20th anniversary with a special episode commemorating it. We'll be talking about the production of the film and also some other fun things as well. So definitely do not miss that episode. It's going to be a super fun one. So I hope to see you all back here next week for that. But until then, I will see you all next time. Take care. Podcast of the Caribbean is in no way affiliated with Disney. If you want to send me an email or question, send it over to podcastofthecaribbean@gmail.com. You can also follow this podcast on Instagram, Threads, and Facebook at Podcast of the Caribbean, and over on Twitter/X and Bluesky at PodcastPOTC. I post fun content over there, so make sure to check those platforms out. You can also buy merchandise for the podcast over on TeePublic and Dashery, and also check out the website at podcastofthecaribbean.com. Be sure to keep a weather eye on the horizon, and always remember, dead men tell no tales.